Everybody in support of His grace, and we hope you all read the book. Halfway through it, and it is phenomenal. It's great. It's really exciting to see the personal side of His grace and His great ministries and everything that He's done for, let's call it, humanity. So with that, Patra, are we going to start? So I'd like to introduce Patra, the co-author. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Patra Sevastiades. May I tell you a little bit about myself? I was raised Roman Catholic. It was a book I read in high school, Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, that moved me to study Russian in college. 5 years later, I was a student in Moscow. It was the summer of 1985, and Mikhail Gorbachev had just come to power in the Soviet Union. That was the first time I ever visited an Orthodox church, my introduction to Orthodox Christianity. The people I saw inside the church were all old women, the only ones willing to risk the wrath of the KGB to attend services. My first professional job was in Washington, D.C., editing scientific papers written by Soviet emigre scientists. After a couple of years, I moved to New York, the mecca of American publishing, eager to make my way there, and took a job, administrative job, at Ballantine Books, part of the Random House publishing empire. When an editorial assistant's job opened up at Pantheon, I jumped at the chance. Meanwhile, I met a publisher at a small New York publishing house, the Rosen Publishing Group. He offered me a job as an editor. A few years later, I became editorial director there. That same publisher, Roger Rosen, introduced me to his friend, Philemon Sevastiades. I was intrigued by this man who grew up near Detroit and in Athens, and who told me he was going to become a Greek Orthodox priest. Philemon and I were married in a tiny Greek Orthodox church in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of New York City. Soon, he was ordained a deacon and then a priest. We had 3 children. Father Philemon began to work at the Archdiocese, working for Archbishop Spiridon. At the time, Philemon met the Chancellor of the Diocese of Chicago, Archimandrite Dmitry Kantzavelos. 2 years later, when there were internal conflicts within the church, Archbishop Spiridon, Father Philemon's boss, resigned. Father Philemon was asked to leave. We found ourselves adrift. I'm grateful to say that the parish in Duluth, Minnesota was in need of a full-time priest. As Chancellor of the Diocese of Chicago, Father Dmitry encouraged Father Philemon to consider the parish. That's what brought us from New York to the Midwest. Eventually, Father Dmitry hired Father Philemon to be, in addition to a parish priest, his coordinator of community relations for the diocese. They formed a fast friendship. When Father Philemon learned about the Chancellor's relationship with a man on Illinois' death row and the Chancellor's social activism opposed to the death penalty, he suggested that the Chancellor write a book about it. Father Philemon even drafted an outline for it. However, Father Philemon died in 2004, and the book he proposed did not come to fruition. Decades later, Father Dmitry, who by now was Bishop Demetrius, and who knew of my publishing background, contacted me about a book idea. The very idea that had been suggested by Father Philemon all those years before. It was a lovely case of coming full circle. I had the pleasure of working with Bishop Demetrius to relate His Grace's astonishing story of being a young priest, one who unexpectedly was called to social activism, a social activism consistent with that of the early church. It has been an honor to work with Bishop Demetrius to relate the story of his fruitful journey. As we went over the manuscript, at which in our hands grew day by day, I frequently asked him, why, or how did that feel, or what did that signify? Remarkably, His Grace was willing to let down his guard and answer. We established a deep and meaningful trust which extends beyond the book itself. Working with Bishop Demetrius has been a genuine joy, for which I thank him. I thank all of you, too, for being here today to celebrate the publication of Grace Unbound. It is my deep pleasure to introduce to you His Grace Bishop Demetrius of
Christos Anesti. Christ is risen. I'm deeply grateful to all of you for being here this evening to celebrate with me and my co-author Patra the publication of Grace Unbound, the sacred activism of an Orthodox bishop. This book has been a labor of love and reflection for several years. It's a deeply personal work, and in many ways it continues the ministry I've been blessed to carry out, not just in the church, but in the broader community, where I've tried to live out the calling to serve, witness, and stand with the marginalized and those in need. As I recount in my book, my entrance into what some would call social justice was something I didn't plan. At the time, it felt unexpected, maybe even accidental, but as I look back, I can see that God was calling me in ways I hadn't imagined, to places I hadn't anticipated going. I wasn't fully prepared, and I certainly had my doubts. But I now believe more than ever that God works through us even, and maybe especially, when we feel unready. That's one of the lessons I hope readers might take from this book. If we're willing to be led, grace finds a way to act through us, even in our hesitation. I won't compare myself to the great figures of Scripture, but I've always drawn strength from their stories. Jonah resisted. Paul persecuted before he proclaimed. Again and again, the Bible reminds us that transformation begins when we respond, however imperfectly, to God's call. Today, perhaps more than ever, those who follow Christ are called to stand with courage and conviction, to be lights in the shadowed places of the world. I was encouraged for many years to put these stories to paper, but the process was harder than I expected. My friend and longtime collaborator in ministry and brother in the Lord, Father David Bissius, and I, who's with us today, by the way, worked on early drafts, but we often found ourselves too close to the material. We had lived these stories, retold them, reflected on the results, but not always on the deeper meaning behind them. It took time and the wisdom of Patra to realize that the heart of this book wasn't about outcomes, but about the journey. She helped me rediscover the personal side of these experiences, to write in a way that didn't feel self-promoting, but honest. Christian ministry, after all, is never about self, it's about service. But she reminded me that sometimes sharing our stories is part of that service. If our experiences can inspire someone else to respond to a need, to speak up, or to stand up in their own way, then the story is worth telling. Patra is more than an editor. She is a co-author in the truest sense. Her insight, her faith, and her artistry helped shape this book into something fuller and more faithful than I could have ever achieved alone. I am incredibly grateful for her presence in this project and in my life. Of course, there are many others to thank. I've mentioned Father David, but I also want to honor the three people who shaped me most deeply. My parents, to whom this book is dedicated. And the dedication reads, For my parents, my father, whose advice should have been heeded. My mother, whose advice is always heeded. And she is with us today as well, wearing that lovely hat to my left. Also, to Metropolitan Iakovos of blessed memory, my spiritual father, mentor, and the man whose blessings made my ministry possible. Before I share two brief selections from Grace Unbound, moments that speak to the ministries that most changed and shaped my life, I want to express heartfelt thanks to a few others who made this evening and this publication possible. To Richard Brown, senior editor of Roman and Littlefield, an imprint of Bloomsbury, I remain deeply grateful for his work in bringing this book to life. I especially appreciate the thoughtful editorial guidance, the steady hand of assistant editor Victoria Sheep, and the meticulous care of production editor Megan Mendel, whose attention to detail helped ensure the clarity and integrity of the final manuscript. Special thanks as well to Andrea Heinkel of the Bindery Agency, whose belief in this project opened the door to publication.